Welcome back to the not quite final session, one panel, and then we have a talk after this. I'm actually going to stay on stage for this one because I've been roped into being a panelist, apparently. So, but I'll let our host introduce.
So, hi everyone. We're going to be discussing automotive, and title is Securing the Road to Autonomy. We'll explain more what that means from our point of view. So first of all, we'll do a round of introductions, then I'll give a bit of an intro about automotive security, and then we'll get to some discussion and questions. There is a microphone at the back, so anyone who's interested in asking questions as we go, pick up your hand, and the microphone will make it to you. Please feel free. We want this to be interactive as much as possible. Okay? So as the microphone is already with me, my name is Meisels. I'm lead solution architect at Cymotive, a cybersecurity company for automotive. For the last 5 years, I've been performing penetration tests for in-vehicle components and leading the penetration testing team. About a couple of months back, I switched to doing architecture full-time, looking to solve issues on a larger scale because, in a sense, it's kind of annoying to find the same issues over and over again. We do find new ones, but automotive has its complexities. We'll get to that too. Except for that, I like to work on badges, so I don't have one with me today, but these electronic badges are, this one, are the kind of stuff I work on in my free time.
So I'm Laurie. I'm an open source and open hardware developer. So I've done a lot of pen testing, hardware hacking, published most of my stuff. I'm also known as RF Idiot or Major Malfunction at DEF CON. Currently working for IBM X-Force Red, but I'm not here officially as X-Force Red, so my opinion's on my own for this one. I do a lot of general hardware level pen testing, so I'm really interested in how automotive is different from any other kind of hardware that we're testing these days, and it's like a really big picture question at the moment that's affecting all of us, so yeah, I'm curious.
My name is Markus Braendle. I'm the head of information and automotive security at CARIAD. So CARIAD is the software company of Volkswagen Group. So we developed the software stack and software platform for all future Volkswagen Group cars. If I look in the audience, I feel suddenly very old somehow. I've been doing security for a while. I spent bit more than a decade with ABB, where I built the entire cybersecurity program. So my first background was in industrial automation. Then I spent about 4.5 years with Airbus in defense and space business. And now since 8 months been with CARIAD. So automotive is also somewhat new to me as well. So I have questions too. So I hope you guys have some answers as well.
Well, maybe I can start with a general question. So, this is like a community of people who do a lot of stuff. We had the talk this morning about the smart teenager level hacking. So I'm curious about the tools that are coming into this environment that enable that level of testing, and how much that's going to be relevant to the automotive industry. We've got things like Flipper Zero, people playing with Tesla charge ports and rolling code stuff for vehicles and so on. How much do you see that as being a driver for change in this industry?
So first of all, let me ask, how many people here own a flipper? Okay, quite a few. So I come from Israel, and locally in Israel right now, most of the people who have flippers are car thieves. And there is a spike in car thefts for specific cars because of this. There's been some controversy. What should they do? Should they ban it? Should they, But in my opinion, this kind of tooling is already making impact. So if you go on TikTok or LinkedIn or Twitter, you're going to see a lot of hacks using flippers. Short term, this is a bad thing. People are getting their cars stolen and so on. But long term, this will force the industry to face up to the fact that there are vulnerabilities that have been known to a certain extent for a while, but have not been addressed. Now, Flipper, in my mind, goes to the area where Metasploit is. So today, anything that's on Metasploit, you would consider needs to be fixed in IT. Same thing here. Whatever is going to make it a Flipper will have to be addressed. It's not going to be a replacement for research in that sense, because there are other tools. So if you're working on NFC, you want to use Proxmark. If you're working on some other stuff, you want to use the tools for those. But as both as a script kiddie thing, which is definitely happening, but also if you want to do, let's say, security testing on large scale, taking a flipper, going through a list of scripts, will help do that more quickly and will allow for rapid evaluation of different vulnerabilities. What I will say, though, is that tooling in automotive is a hard topic in general. There isn't enough tooling, and when there is, it's really expensive. So one of the personal projects I'm working on right now is trying to bring CAN-FD USB adapters to be cheaper within some open source design. So that probably will happen later this year. You can find a lot of CAN adapters with USB for very cheap, but the ones which are CAN-FD and more advanced are still quite expensive. If you know what you're doing, you can hack something together, but there really needs to be more open tooling.
Yeah, so one of the things I found interesting, like every time there's a new technology that's used by, potential attackers, there's a bunch of people that cry and say, oh, it should be banned. I think that's completely the wrong approach. And, we've seen this, and again, I'm old. We've seen this now a couple of times, even in my career. There's some new tooling comes out, right? Usually, the offensive side is quicker in adapting, right? But I've always felt that that's also an opportunity when you develop stuff to improve. Right now, I think part of the challenge on the automotive side using these kind of tools, and you said it, right? It's not cheap because if you really want to get the most value out of those tools, you need to have proper test setups and proper systems that you use them with, right? Because what you want to understand is not just the communication went down or whatever like this. You really want to understand what's the impact on the whole car, right? Because at the end of the day, we care about reliability, we care about availability, we care about safety, first and foremost. But again, these I kind of had to smile when you asked this question. I remember on the industrial automation side, 15 years ago when some of these toolings came up and some of the companies started pushing, right? There were some big vendors that were like, oh, no, why are you doing this? You shouldn't be doing this. This is not according to spec. And some others just said, hey, that's awesome. That allows us to better understand the products that we develop and helps us make them better. So I think that's the approach we need to take to these tools.
So I think that brings us to the next question, which is, what is the real difference between automotive security, IT security, industrial security? And Markus alluded to that, but I think it's a really interesting topic because when people say automotive, they think one thing, but in practice, it's probably more complicated. Want to start? Sure.
So I think they're both differences and similarities, right? And the real challenge for me has always been you want to adapt as much as you can from traditional IT security, because one of the benefits that we have in industries that are a bit slower in adapting technologies, we can learn a lot from industries that are faster, that have adopted these technologies before, and we can, take over some of the security approaches they have taken. I think the real art then is not just blindly taking that over, but adapting it to the ecosystem you're applying it. And one of the things, so between industrial automation and automotive, one of the things that's very similar is the long life cycles, right? When I used to work in industrial automation, we used to talk about that our systems would be in use for 20, 30 years and would never see an upgrade. With cars, today we are developing within CARIAD software and building technology stacks that will go into cars that production will start around 2030. And cars will be then on the road for another 10, 15, 20 years. So some of the things we're developing now and working on now will still be in use until 2050. So that's, of course, time-wise, a completely different horizon than in traditional IT. So I think that's a very big difference. What makes automotive security, in my view, even harder than a little bit than industrial, is industrial at least, the equipment is with the asset owner. So there is some physical, not always, but at least some physical protection. in terms of, automotive, it's very simple to get your hands on a car and learn a lot about it. And, there's no physical boundaries or protection to these cars. And then the other thing, of course, with all the remote online services that are now being introduced, there's a lot more connectivity coming as well in the future. So again, I think there's a lot of similarities. And for us to be successful in automotive security, I think we need to learn as much as we can from everyone else in different industries, adapt as much as we can, but then again, be smart about where do we need to tailor a little bit so that it really is fit for purpose.
So are you guys doing anything in the sort of bug bounty space or opening up to the open source world for input into vehicle software development?
To be honest, bug bounty we currently don't do. We may do that in the future, and actually I just had a quick discussion in the break about that. So for me, before you open up for a bug bounty, you need to be ready to deal with whatever people find. So doing a bug bounty program and then, potentially you get a lot of input, but you can't do anything with it, doesn't help anyone. So doing a bug bounty program on the backends that are used for remote online services, for me, could potentially make a lot of sense. Putting a car somewhere and saying, have at it, could be very interesting, right? But again, then we're back to some of those specifics of the car industry where it's not that easy to patch a car, depending on where the vulnerabilities are. So today, no, we don't have a bug bounty program. And again, it's not because I disagree with bug bounty programs, but I think as an industry, we're probably not ready for this. And I think it will lead to more frustrations than it would actually help in the short term.
So I will add, though, that the ZDI, which are behind Pawn to Own, are targeting in 24 to start a specific Pawn to Own event for automotive in Tokyo. So you can track that, and if you're interested, by all means, this will be an interesting event to start working on automotive. But really, you also have to understand, maybe this is a bit of background about what is a vehicle and how it's built. So if we start with what is a vehicle? You have a distributed system, you have multiple electronic control units, and traditionally these use Canvas. We'll maybe speak about that a bit later. But these are all coming from different companies. So if you see an OEM, the manufacturer of the vehicle, you see the vehicle and it has in the front the symbol. That doesn't mean they build all the parts. Quite the opposite. They have specified what is necessary, and they pass these down to tier ones, which are the companies which build these specific components, and then they integrate everything together. The first time I was introduced to this, for me, it was amazing to see that this even works, because you have, tens of different companies supplying components, and that's just the boxes. Each one of these has sub-suppliers and so on, and somehow this all works together. And then when we have these issues of updating, it's regulatory because it takes a lot of time to get updates cleared from a safety perspective. But you also have to have all the suppliers in the whole supply chain work together in order to create these updates. And this is really an issue. So far, we have not seen, at least publicly, a remote code execution attack, which was, widely deployed on vehicles, but it's just a matter of time. Okay. And also, if you think about it, if we go back, 15, 20 years, phones, it wasn't common to hear about, attacks on phones. There was an antivirus, but what really happened is the consolidation of the smartphone field into Android and iOS. And at that point, both the devices had more interesting information on them. So there was a larger incentive, but also with one bug, you could pawn a lot of devices. So the same thing will be happening in automotive. We're slowly seeing more consolidation of platforms, more vehicles with the same components. And this is both for hardware and software. It makes sense that we will also see more attacker interests. Whoever's tracking ransomwares, automotive is being targeted a lot on the IT side. And as they know that it works, they do make money off of this, otherwise they wouldn't do it, then probably they will shift at some point also to look at vehicles. And then they will not ask you as the owner to pay, but rather the OEM, because they have the money. So that's, let's say, more from the incentive side. But it really, what I'm trying to get to is that what is different, at least for me, about automotive is this combination of really advanced technologies. You have virtualization. You even have Kubernetes clusters in some vehicles. I don't know why someone would want to do that, but that's a different topic. And on the other hand, you might have a microcontroller which is so weak that it has no cryptography whatsoever, and the only thing it needs to do is, turn a motor based on a CAN message. So, and somehow all of this needs to work together and be secure, which is a really hard challenge.
So that actually leads me to my next question is crypto the answer to everything? Because currently, a vehicle is a bunch of computers that talk to each other in plain text over CAN. So is it even possible to think about that should all be authenticated and you shouldn't be able to just plug in to a CAN bus and start sending or replaying messages or sniffing the traffic? Would that be a realistic goal?
So for sure, crypto is part of the answer, and having authenticated traffic needs to be the goal, right? And I'm always, again, when people say crypto, I want to be very clear. We're talking about authentication. Encryption within the car is probably not necessary. When you then talk about from car to back end, it's a different story. But again, I think part of the challenge we have with crypto is the long life cycles, right? The hardware we design now, again, might be on the road until 2040, 2050. So we need to talk about things like crypto agility. How do we create systems that allow us to update both keys as well as algorithms? One of the things that I found interesting when I came into this industry, which I underestimated, is the cost pressure. Right, so I was like, oh, well, that's easy. Let's just put in, an HSM or some crypto support onto the chips, and off we go. But the way the OEMs look at this is, of course, scale. So if you add a chip that costs €2 more, right, we might think, oh, that's nothing. But they go like, that's €2 times 10 million cars. So that's an investment of 20 million euros. And that's part of the challenge, right? Which I sort of underestimated, but for sure, I think crypto is part of the solution. I don't think it's the solution. And it's something that we are actively working on.
So let me add to that another point. The business model for automotive for years has been make very little money on the on the first sale, but make money off, for example, repairs and services and so on. We're going to an electric future. This changes. We're looking at more services coming in, basically trying to make the vehicle a smartphone on wheels. And this in itself is very different than what used to be. So when we speak about pressure for the product, you got to think that every single dollar the vehicle costs is directly, like you have to cover from somewhere else. You have to make money again. And also, so we spoke about cryptography. Of course, key deployment is a huge issue for these kind of systems. And we're talking about, let's say, 70 different chips or 200 different chips, which you're going to have to deploy keys to. This is very hard in general. I think another option, which is not necessarily done enough today, is more hardware-based security for the hardware functions. So if we're looking at sensors and stuff, for example, classic thing, you have a tire pressure monitoring system, which monitors the tire pressure. And some of these for trucks these days have built-in pumps, which will pump up the tire. As long as they have a pressure release valve, no matter how low you'll set the pressure on the sensor, this is not something that an attacker can probably avoid. But if we speak about things which are, let's say, not protected by physical means, then you slowly, you work your way through the system and you figure out a way to spoof deeper and to avoid and create safety issues. Okay? So one of the things automotive industry is really good with is safety. If you look at the designs, they're verified. They do a lot of code generation in order to not rewrite the code every single time. The code will be checked really in depth, but you can use the same code again and again. This has a good side to it because from a safety perspective, you know what you're putting into the vehicle and you can, some of it even formally verify certain things. But then from a security perspective, if there is a security issue, it propagates across the board to many different products. Okay? So that's something you see a lot, that you see a package being used or some code generation being used. And that means that the same vulnerability can appear in various different products from different manufacturers because they use a common supplier. Yeah.
While we're going along, has anyone thought of any questions you want to throw out from the audience? Okay. I'm really curious as well about, we all know the sort of threat landscape is changing, but when an attacker is successful against a vehicle, as we move more towards autonomous vehicles, how do you see that changing the outcomes of successful attacks? What is going to be the target of the attack, and what effect is that going to have on the person in the vehicle or people around the vehicle?
Yeah, I'll start also with what we're seeing now. So we spoke about flippers. A lot of things today are car theft. When you have, let's say, a robotaxi service, probably not as interesting in the same way. But there's a couple of threats here. If we talk about large scale, so earlier in the critical infrastructure panel, they spoke about what it means to stop all trains. Think about stopping all cars. The damage that would do if a large amount of cars are stopped at once could be huge. And we saw something similar, I believe, in Moscow, I think it was already last year, where some hackers, I'm not sure if it was hackers or social engineering, they ordered all the taxis in Moscow to the same point and caused a traffic jam. Now, and this was humans who could think, and they were supposed to see that they're entering a traffic jam. If someone were to order all the autonomous fleet to the same spot, unless you have some good fraud detection, you would end up with this kind of issue. And this is before safety, just by denial of service. But safety on various different levels can be compromised by attacking the fleet. So if we're talking about sensors, you can try, and there is adversarial AI attacks today, which try to trick the sensors into seeing something which isn't there, or not seeing something that is there. And this is something that a human would maybe notice, but sometimes it isn't. It can be a dot on a sign, which would just cause the algorithm to interpret it differently. But for us, we don't even notice because it just seems like a blemish on the sign. But there's when you think about autonomous driving, so you have the sensors coming in, and they're capturing a state of what is going around. Then you have to have some sort of fusion in order to get an object model of all the objects you're seeing. And then you need to have the algorithm operate on that. But additionally, you need to have very good maps. These are coming in possibly from the cloud. So that needs to be secured also. If someone can get to those maps or to the connection, you can have, you can trick the vehicle in a sense to not to drive into a wall, but to lose its way to the target. Yeah. So these are just some of the examples of what could happen here.
So in my head, I'm trying to unbox that question because I think there's a lot of, it seems like a simple question, right? What's the threat on autonomous driving? But I think it's actually quite a complex question because number one, a car isn't a single system, right? There's some elements like the infotainment that is probably easier to get into than other elements in a car, which are, for instance, the autonomous driving pieces. And then you also have to ask yourself the question, what's the attack model? Is it, a remote type attack? Is it something local? Is it targeted? Is it a generic, let's go get everyone? And depending on what the scenario is, I think the answer is quite different, right? You talked about ransomware. I would actually argue, for attackers, they might not actually target the OEMs, because if they target, the infotainment system. So think about this. You get into your car in the morning, you have to drive to work. There's a pop-up message that says, haha, ransomware, I own your car. Pay me €2 to unlock, right? And you're in a hurry. You need to get to a job interview. You're going to hit the button, pay the €2, off you go. You're not going to think about that. If I do that a million times, I make €2 million, likelihood of being prosecuted, 0, right? If I try to make 2 million off a OEM, right, different story. So again, I think it's a very complex topic. The one thing that with autonomous driving and the what if scenario that I am a little bit worried about and curious to see how it goes, I hope we never find out, is it's not going to be a rational discussion. It's going to be an emotional discussion, right? Let's, assume there's an accident because of an autonomous vehicle, whether it's been hacked or not, right? If a human has an accident, we tend to be able to accept this and forgive, unless there's special circumstances, of course. We say, the person didn't see, the pedestrian because of the sun, or something like this. If the same thing happens with an autonomous car, I think the reaction will be very different. And at that point, we can have all the statistics we want that show that, it's been more safe, there's been less accidents, there's been less, injuries, all these kind of things. It will be a very different, I believe, reaction on an emotional level, because you're no longer sort of looking at a human that made an error. You're looking at something that was supposed to be perfect, right? And I think that for me is again, when you ask me these questions, that's for me also where my mind goes, because I think it's a very complex thing to answer.
Yeah, sorry. Excuse me. As a sort of red team attacker, that's you try and think, well, what would I try and make it do? Am I going to just stop the car? Or am I going to say, well, if you don't pay me 200 euros, then I'm going to smash into the next lamppost, or I'm going to, make a decision to kill the next pedestrian I see, or something like this. So I think the consequences potentially are huge. So the question, I guess, then is, we heard in the one of the panels earlier, they talked about the train driver having a big red button that cuts the pneumatic and the brakes come on. So what are the big red buttons in the autonomous vehicle?
Yes, and I think for that also, autonomous driving comes at different levels, right? I'm not the best expert here, so take anything I'm just about to say with a grain of salt, but you may have heard, level 2, level 2++, level 3, level 4 type autonomous driving. And the big difference isn't in the technology and the capabilities of, detecting obstacles or being able to control the car. The difference is mainly in the role of the driver, right? So it starts with, something like a lane assistance. You are still driving, but if you start, going out of the lane, the car will pull you back, right? And if you do that 2 times, the car will say, get your hands on the steering wheel. And then, so then the sort of the next level is, or things like distance control. Some manufacturers have now gotten the approval for autonomous driving in a sense of, on the highway below 60 kilometers per hour, it's autonomous driving, but in that case, it still means you need to have your hands on the steering wheel. And then again, there's one level where essentially the driver has to be able to take over within seconds. So what that means as a driver, you can take your hands off the wheel, but you still need to stay alert. And in all of those scenarios, right, the red button is essentially you grabbing the steering wheel and taking back control of the car. If it's and for now, I would argue most of the cases it is possible, right?
What because if the car's now the malicious actor?
So hold on a sec. So let me and then level 4 is where it gets really interesting. Level 4 is basically where, as a driver, right, you can lean back, you can take a nap, you can watch a movie, and the car needs to be able to tell you, and say, hey, in 5 minutes, we're getting to an area that, the curves are too narrow or whatever, where you have to take over. And I think that's, again, where, so if you're thinking out, you're taking a nap and then the car is in full control, or you're watching a movie, that's a whole different scenarios, right? But at the end of the day, all of these things, and sorry to say this, these horror scenarios, someone is going to completely take it over. We had these discussions in industrial automation. Someone is going to blow up a chemical plant, a nuclear power plant, all these kind of things. At the end of the day, this is where safety comes in, so that you build these systems so that you have that emergency big red button, right, that you can press? And could I come up with a scenario to circumvent that? I could, you certainly could, right? That's what some creative people can do. Is that very likely? I don't think so. There's always a risk, right? Few things I learned is never say never, never say, it can't happen. But I think we sort of need to be realistic. So attacking a whole fleet and making all the cars drive into a tree without any driver being able to do anything, is it a possible scenario? Yes, anything is possible. Is it a likely scenario? No.
So I'd say that in general, I would agree with the sentiment here that a larger scale attack is harder, especially if it's going to be physical. But that's why I think the ransomware route would be more likely. And also, many times if you compromise a car, you basically can now speak to the back end. And potentially this would actually be a vector just for attacking the IT infrastructure, which maybe holds even more value if you think about it, because that's where everything is coming from. And the same thing if we speak about electrification, which has also started being a very big topic. So when you plug in the charging gun today, the newest vehicles are using Ethernet. Okay, so you have to understand that there's an Ethernet stack on both ends, both in the charger to a certain extent and also in the vehicle. So there is more happening the whole time. And again, this is not strictly for autonomous, but there is a larger threat over time with things coming in. So I think they spoke about this earlier during the critical infrastructure. If all the vehicles were to charge at the same time, this would affect the grid very badly, because this is not what the grid is designed to do at this point, and probably will never be. And these kind of things, when we look at a large scale attack, I would think that this is more likely that not that it would be likely, but in, let's say, a military situation, maybe a state would decide to try and do some drastic measures, trying to shut down stuff. I will say though, if we spoke about, how easy are things done, so there is a shift into architectural shift. So automotive is really many times about isolation. And you see that functions are isolated between different control units. And then these days you have what's called a security gateway. You can think about this like a router, and you usually have a separate, so CAN bus is a bus, everything on it sees all the messaging, but you'll have different buses between different domains and some sort of router, the gateway, just so things can move between them. But we're also seeing newer designs which use what's called a zonal architecture. And this is actually not only for security reasons, but actually mostly for performance, where you have a bunch of smaller gateways throughout the vehicle for specific zones physically. That means communications for the sensors have to go over less distance in cabling, less control units. But this also means that potentially there is some more fault tolerance here. It's not a single point of failure anymore. In many vehicles today, if you compromise the gateway, you have full control of the network. And in the future, this is not enough anymore to that sense. So we're going to see a lot more physical isolation. You're going to see a lot more virtualization. We're even seeing embedded chips which have virtualization for real-time operating systems. Yes, it's kind of weird, but it works. So this will be part of the solution to try and protect these more advanced vehicles.
You just said two things that trigger me. So one, I agree to. We talked a lot about the car being the target of an attack. We also need to look at the car being a means to an end, to get into the back end and potentially get into the IT, which I think is also quite an interesting scenario. Absolutely. There's another thing that just popped into my head. In the beginning, the question was, IT versus automotive and what you just said. So one of the advantages we have in automotive, same as in industrial, in principle, we know exactly how these systems are built. We know exactly what types of communication we should see. We know exactly who is supposed to talk to whom, right? So there isn't this element of uncertainty, and there certainly isn't this element like on the IT where new nodes can pop up, new communications pop up, new applications pop up, and you need to sort of have a security concept that allows that flexibility, right? Within a car, especially within all those systems that are, driving or steering or stopping the car, we know exactly what that system looks like, and it isn't going to change very frequently. And that's, I think, one of those things that really helps us in terms of securing it. If you look at something like intrusion detection or intrusion prevention systems, right? They are very useful. I think they're even more useful on the automotive side because, again, in principle, we should be able to map out all the communication and say this is the only communication we should see. So really create a complete whitelist and say anything that isn't on that whitelist just isn't allowed to happen. So I think that's really an opportunity in terms of security because, again, we know these systems and they're not going to, change on the fly.
So we're pretty much out of time, but is there one last thing you need to get out there before we end this session?
So I think many people think automotive is complicated, and we spoke about a bunch of topics here, but anyone in this room can go and do some automotive work. So some people have more embedded security background, but even working on automotive IT systems will be really beneficial. So I encourage everyone to go out and do some work on automotive. If you want to know how to get started, come speak to me after. I can give you some ideas. But we really want to see more people working on this because the criminals and nation states already are. So we need to be there first as white hats before it becomes very bad, if it does.
And potentially you win a car. Any questions? Oh, okay. Well, that's a wrap then. Thank you.
Awesome.